Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. You guys sent in a bunch of clips from this Joe Rogan experience. Had Shawn Ryan on there. Seems like you're pretty fascinated by some of the conspiracy theories they were getting into.
Yeah, definitely some interesting topics.
Right. And, you're not necessarily saying you believe all this stuff, but you want to understand, like, where are these theories coming from and what does it say about, well, the world we're living in today?
For sure. And I mean, right off the bat, you got to admit, Sean Ryan's background, ex-SEAL, worked for the CIA. It adds this whole other layer to it, right? Like
Right.
he's seen some things, maybe knows things the rest of us don't.
Absolutely. That insider knowledge thing totally makes you want to listen a little closer. You know what I mean? And he really goes to the UFOs, government cover-ups, nothing's off limits.
Kind of wild, yeah.
But here's what I find interesting. Even Rogan, who, let's be honest, usually starts these conversations with a good dose of skepticism, even he seems like he's kind of captivated by some of the stuff Ryan's saying.
Right, like you almost can't help but be drawn in, even if you're trying to be skeptical.
Exactly. And, that skepticism, that's kind of the default for most of us when we hear about these wild conspiracy theories, right? Like, we want to believe, or at least some part of us does, but then that other part's like, come on, get real.
It's that balance, right? Between wanting to believe in something bigger, something more exciting, and then the reality of, what's actually plausible.
Totally. Like, take that story Ryan tells about his ex-girlfriend. So she's working on some government database or something, and she stumbles across information about little green men. I mean, come on, it sounds like something straight out of a movie, right?
It does, but it plays on that fear that there are things going on behind closed doors, things the government doesn't want us to know about.
100%. And that ties into this whole concept of government compartmentalization, right? Where information is so divided, so secretive, that even people within the government only see tiny pieces of the puzzle.
Right, so like you could be working on something for years, have no idea what the bigger picture is, or even worse, draw completely wrong conclusions based on the limited information you have.
And on the one hand, you can see why some level of secrecy might be necessary. I mean, there are legitimate national security concerns and all that, but it's also easy to see how that lack of transparency could lead to suspicion, distrust, as like fertile ground for conspiracy theories.
No doubt. And it's not always about UFOs and aliens, right? A lot of these theories center around more grounded concerns like corruption, abuse of power.
Totally. Like, they go into some of the theories surrounding JFK's assassination, and there's this whole thing about what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. might have been looking into about corporate influence, especially within the FDA.
It's interesting, right? Because that segues into this broader conversation they have about corporate influence and the potential consequences, especially when it comes to things like pharmaceuticals and public health.
Yeah. And Rogan drops this crazy statistic. He says something like a third of FDA-approved drugs end up getting recalled. Like, think about that. 1 in 3 medications that get the official green light later turn out to be dangerous.
It's definitely a head scratcher. You have to wonder, what does that say about the approval process itself?
Right. Are there long-term effects that aren't showing up in the initial testing? Or is there something else going on, like pressure from big pharma to push these drugs through?
And those are the kinds of questions that fuel conspiracy theories, right? When people see those inconsistencies, like a drug being deemed safe one day and recalled the next, it erodes trust. It makes you wonder, are the people in charge actually looking out for us, or are there other, maybe less noble motivations at play?
It's that lack of transparency again, that feeling like we're not getting the whole story
Yeah.
that makes people suspicious.
Exactly. It's like, who benefits from keeping us in the dark?
And that, my friend, is the million-dollar question. And it's like, from corporate influence, that they kind of shift gears a little bit and start talking about staged political events.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, they bring up this Kamala Harris rally and how cell phone data, they talk about something called geofencing, can be used to track where people are.
Right.
And it's like, maybe that crowd of supporters, maybe it wasn't as organic as it seemed.
Interesting.
And that just gets you thinking, right? Because we see these images, these rallies, these crowds cheering, and we kind of assume it's genuine.
It's easy to get caught up in the moment, yeah.
But Rogan, I mean, he's been there, right? He's done the game show thing. He's seen how these things work behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And he's like, it's not that crazy to think that someone could manufacture that kind of, that energy, that excitement.
I mean, if you're thinking about it that way, it's almost like...
It makes you wonder, are we really seeing what we think we're seeing? And it kind of ties into this whole other thing they get into about media bias. They talk about this alleged ABC News thing, an affidavit, where someone's claiming they were feeding Kamala Harris debate questions.
Oh, wow.
Right. And then there's this whole other thing about the whistleblower supposedly dying in a car crash,
Oh, no.
which, by the way, turned out to be totally false.
Really?
Yeah, but here's the thing. The fact that it spread so fast that people were so quick to believe it.
It's scary how easily misinformation can take hold.
It is, and it makes you wonder, what's true anymore?
It's almost like you can't trust anything you read online.
And what's so sneaky about that whole whistleblower thing, the car crash, it's like a classic tactic, right?
What do you mean?
You introduce something totally made up, and then when it gets debunked, it discredits everything else, even if there were some legitimate points being made.
It's like they're trying to muddy the waters, make it impossible to tell what's real and what's not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it works. Because we're bombarded with so much information these days, it's overwhelming.
You just kind of shut down after a while.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
how are you supposed to sort through all the noise? And when you've got that distrust already there, whether it's the media, the government, whoever,
People are going to start looking for answers elsewhere.
and that's where those conspiracy theories, they start to sound a little more appealing, a little more believable. It's wild, right? Like, that whole conversation takes this turn, and they start talking about China. And, not China, like in general, but specifically how much the U.S. relies on them for, like, manufacturing and stuff.
Right, like all the supply chains and everything.
Exactly. And they bring up this example, the power grid. And it's like, you wouldn't necessarily think about it, but we get a lot of the components, the parts, from China. And they're basically saying, well, that could be a problem. What if something happens, some kind of conflict, and suddenly we're vulnerable?
It's like we've built this whole system, this infrastructure, but we don't necessarily control all the pieces.
Exactly. And that gets into this bigger question of, like, globalization. Yeah, because on the one hand, it's been great, right? Cheaper goods, more access to technology, all that.
Sure.
But then there's that other side, the potential downsides, the risks that maybe we don't always think about.
Absolutely. And sometimes those risks, they involve real people,
Right. And to illustrate that point, they talk about this really disturbing thing, the suicide nets at the Foxconn factory.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Foxconn, for people who don't know, they're huge. They make stuff for Apple, all the big tech companies.
Right, like iPhones, computers, all that.
Exactly. And the fact that they had to put up those nets, it's a reminder, like, what are the real costs of all this stuff we take for granted?
It's easy to forget, sitting here with our gadgets, that there are real people on the other end of that supply chain.
For sure. And speaking of things that are both amazing and kind of terrifying,
Uh-oh, where are we going now?
they end on this whole AI thing.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it's everywhere these days, right? But they go deep.
Okay.
They're talking about AI not just replacing jobs, which is a whole other conversation,
Right.
but like AI becoming smarter than us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like what happens then? Do we lose control?
Those are some big questions.
Right. And it's like, is this the future? Are we on the verge of something incredible, or are we creating something that we're going to regret?
It's kind of a trip, right? When you really start thinking about all this stuff.
It is. It makes you question everything. But that's kind of the point of these deep dives, right?
Yeah.
To explore these ideas, even if they make us a little uncomfortable.
For sure. It's about being aware, being informed, so we can make the best decisions for ourselves and for the future.
100%. And hey, if these conversations get you thinking, if you're out there wondering, what if? Well, that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Keep asking questions, keep digging for answers. Who knows what you might find?
You never know. That's what makes it so fascinating.